Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah. We are reviewing in summary this whole idea of positive Islamic psychology principles, as well as the same principles that we're going to use in our new book, Positive Islamic Cognitive Behavior Therapy. These are series of books on positive Islamic psychology that inshallah will be published by Positive Islamic Psychology Center, and we spread this message of positive worldview of Islam so that we will strengthen the ummah as we face the challenges of the 21st century. So I have explained to you the first principle of PICBT, that is understanding the creator and the created universe in terms of our existence in the physical world and in the spiritual world, and in the understanding of the who is Allah and why we have to believe in a creator. The second principle is the holistic transcendent nature of the human self. That means this human self is not just only a physical body, but comprises the spiritual self, that is a spiritual, emotional, mental and physical self, the four realms of existence or domain that Allah has created, and how we can prove the existence of these four domains. Then the third principle is on being the Caliph of Allah, that we are here in this world to be with a purpose and meaning, that is to be the vicegerent of God on this earth. And as being the vicegerent, we have three basic principles and values that we have to maintain, which can be used very, very strongly in terms of the worldview as we do positive Islamic cognitive behavior therapy, because this foundation of being the vicegerent of Allah is the most positive worldview ever, in the sense of understanding the nature of human existence, that we are the Caliph of Allah, the vicegerent of Allah, that we have to strive to make ourselves good, help others to be good, and make the world good, and how we can enhance this goodness so that we spread this positive message for internally, that means our internal transformation towards goodness, and the external interpersonal and global consciousness, in which we can develop a very wonderful idea based on the Quran and the Sunnah, which is so important for the Ummah as we face the challenges now. So today I'm going to explain to you the fourth principle, the holistic principles of human behavior and laws of learning. This is mostly the work of the late Allahyarham Professor Muhammad Madi Jenkins. He wrote a lot of these ideas while he was a researcher together with the father of modern behavior psychology, B.F. Skinner. So he is a protege of B.F. Skinner, and I would like to read some of the material that he has written here. Just a summary, because this whole chapter is very long. Holistic principles of human behavior and learning is very important, because if we want to create positive Islamic cognitive behavior therapy, we have to understand this very deeply, and there's 130 pages here. So those who want to do the certification courses in terms of positive Islamic cognitive behavior therapy, they have to master this, because this is very deep. It is just not the shallow kind of popular psychology, but these are factual psychology that you can do a lot of research on, based on the ideas that is propounded there, and the extrapolation that you can do in terms of your therapeutic approach towards pathological problems within the ummah, or in terms of the psychological problems that we face in the world today. So a lot of these ideas can be reframed using your own research material, but master this first. So I'm just going to run through this whole chapter here, 130 pages. So the fourth principle, holistic principles of human behavior and laws of learning, and I just take the first chapter, introduction. This chapter on the application of holistic principles of behavior and laws of learning to transform contemporary society is mostly the work of the late Professor Muhammad Madi Jenkins before he converted to Islam. So he has been doing this research even while he was with B.F. Skinner, and he has a radical view which is entirely different from the animal model that B.F. Skinner is propounding. He is propounding this idea of a human model with our own internal inner speech and internal psychology, which is radically different from the behavior of animals. He started his search for truth and completed the trilogy of the concept of the unified theory of existence. He wrote 3 books before he became a Muslim. These 3 books are the Unified Theory of Existence, book 1, 2, 3, after leaving the university, because when he was propounding this idea, those people around B.F. Skinner were all hardcore behavioralists, psychologists, and they just make fun of this poor fella. All right, at that time his name is John Jenkins. He left the university and became a hippie. Yeah? Professor Jenkins' deep research in Islamic theology of the unity of being, Tawheed, enhanced his idea of positive psychology. Later he realized the beauty and truth of the Islamic concept of the vicegerent of God in Islam. That means the Khalifa concept. Okay, since his demise in 2006, this work has been continued by me, and we are trying to propound this idea, as I say, spread this message, this positive message of positive Islamic psychology to the world. So, human behavior and human learning are extremely complex phenomena. As you develop more knowledge on the nature of the human self, as well as the scientific discoveries of the nature and the function of our brain, we will have a better understanding of the holistic nature of human behavior and learning. The behavior process that occurs within our mind is complex. It combines input from the cognitive, emotive, spiritual, and other subtle interaction. The totality of this interaction have to include our spiritual, intuitive aspect of our being. This holistic interaction requires more research and can lead us towards the understanding of the holistic concept of human behavior and human learning. So this is basically some idea about what he has said. All right. And there are many chapters on this whole thing. For example, in psychology, we have to use what we call directed positive influence. So how do we apply directed positive influence? For example, change to directed positive influence. This is very important actually in the 21st century, all right? The death facing the human race is not so much a threat as an alternative. The actions, all action has some outcome. Whether we do the positive action, we have a positive outcome, negative action, negative outcome, collective action, collective destruction. So it is often possible to predict beforehand what will be the probable outcome of any action. If we consider the overall human behavior in human society, that means at present, as the action, we can predict very reliably what the outcome will be. It will be the destruction of human life. That means even 35 years ago, he have seen this idea that this greed, this consumerism, this idea that this planet Earth, we can pollute and destroy, pump CO2 to the extent that today we have the CO2 level that is the highest ever in the history of humanity, in the history of the world. For more than 400 million years, we didn't have this kind of extreme CO2 level, and it will result in extreme weather pattern, result in the melting of the polar ice, result in the releasing of the methane gases now in hydrate form, because once the temperature rise, the methane will just be gone to the atmosphere, and methane is 20 times more potent in terms of the destructive greenhouse effect. So if we are not careful, within 30 or 40 years, this whole world that we inhabit today will have so great weather variation, from drought to flood to typhoon to hurricane to water shortage and so on, that this whole civilization can collapse. So it is a psychological problem. So when we talk about this, how are we going to use positive Islamic psychology to develop change to directed positive influence? So, for example, it will be the destruction of human race, perhaps all life on this earth. Once we realize this, we must choose to change and live in harmony with the natural order, or accept the natural consequence of society wrongs action. Indeed, I believe the threat of extinction of the human race would not be sufficient to save us because of the weakness of negative control. This is another concept of psychology, the concept of negative control. Again, you have to understand this idea of how the impact of negative control will not actually be able to overcome this negative trait within a society that is well hell-bent on greed, on, for example, the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, on just consumption, more consumption, regardless of the ethics of existence, regardless of the ethics of the need to have a balance, because this world, this earth, is all interconnected to us. So this is some of the idea. I've just taken some chapter. Then we talk about how are we going to change. So harnessing people's power. All right. So we'll have to harness how we as human beings, we as Muslims, 1.7 billion Muslims in the world, we can harness our intrinsic capability, because collectively we are very powerful. Individually we are nobody. but collectively we are very powerful. So how are we going to direct the Muslim Ummah of harnessing the Ummahtic power towards positive world, towards goodness? That means now the Ummah, the harnessing of the Ummahtic power is now misdirected. We are misdirected towards a very parochial, very toxic, very cancerous idea of force, of compulsion, of an idea of Islam that we must fight everybody in the world, and an idea of Islam that is very negative in terms of we commit all kind of crimes, suicide bombing, murders, all because we want to set up a power base. That is just this kind of political Islam is very destructive. So we have to change. How are we going to exist, harnessing the power of the Ummah to become good human beings, living in harmony with all other human beings, regardless of their race, color, or religion? We have to live together because Allah has ordained until the last breath of this earth, we will have Christians, we will have Hindus, we will have Buddhists, we will have lots of varieties. For example, in the Western world, 90% of those in the Western world doesn't have any religion anymore. They are atheists. So we will have to confront them gently. How? First, we must learn how to accept as they are, because that's what Rasulullah teaches us, that we must be able to gently, out of real love for them, real concern for them, that we bring about change through positive directed influence. This is an idea that Professor Mahdi Jangkar had written this about 35, 40 years ago. And the whole idea of how to harness the Ummah and how to use it so that we can use positive directive influence to using the capability of the Ummah to change. And slowly but surely, inshallah, we will then impact the world to become a wonderful world where Muslims can live in peace and happiness with all human beings in the world. So if I'm just taking only 3 pages from here, so if there are many other pages, you will be surprised at the depth of the learning. For example, what are the keys, some of the subtopic, the keys to knowledge and truth. So how do we know that Islam is the truth? What are the keys, the empirical evidence and the philosophical worldview that we are going to talk about? So, for example, he says, truth is like a seed which once planted in the mind of an individual germinates, spreading its roots throughout the social body of the human race and flowering in the collective consciousness of humanity. Such beautiful words. So this is what we are trying to do in Positive Islamic Psychology, and now in this new book I'm trying to write of Positive Islamic Cognitive Behavior Therapy, because if we can change our cognitive framework, we can change ourselves and inshallah change the Ummah and change the world. Then we talk about inner speech, which I explained to you, how this concept of inner speech. So what is inner speech? Inner speech means the internal communication with your own consciousness. This includes thoughts, but much more comprehensive than that. It includes not only thoughts, but feelings. Inner speech of all communication that originates within the mind, that means the physical brain and the akal. We are not yet aware of the full range of these communications. Some of the communications within the mind takes place beyond the perception of ordinary waking consciousness. Future research needs to be done to understand the communication at the level of the spiritual, emotional, mental domain, which I have explained detailed in principle number 1, number 2, and number 3 in this book. So again, he explained to you what it is about the nature of inner speech. The nature of consciousness and inner speech, which I have explained to you in the previous video, which I have extracted from here. Then we have the nature of animal learning. What is the difference between animal learning and human learning? Types of conditioning. We talk about classical conditioning. We talk about operant conditioning, how we can use some of this operant conditioning in PICBT, because it's very important. Those are empirical evidence in which we can correlate and which we can actually extrapolate towards using it. The concept of reward and punishment in psychology, the concept of reinforcement and learning, then how we are going to develop the environmental condition and goal setting. So for example, if we want to do PICBT, we must have what are the environmental situation in terms of environmental scanning of the particular person who has a pathological psychological disorder, and what are the goal settings that we can actually apply using PICBT approach. We can talk about the shaping process, very, very important, that anything that we do, we must go through the shaping process and the importance of loss of learning. We can also understand the limits of our behavior. How are we going to work out in terms of our behavior? We talk about generalization, nature of human learning, how we talk about how our behavior are shaped by social reinforcement. So the whole idea of social reinforcement is very important in psychology. What is the nature of anxiety? What is the nature of negative conditioning? And then applying the laws of learning as a foundation for social change. So we have to change our ummah. This is some of the ideas that is listed here. Then what are the influence of inner speech? Understanding of the concept of fairness, honesty, and justice and truth. So this is very important in psychology. We just don't talk about theoretical aspect. We talk how we're going to develop in PIE CBT, how we're going to treat or how we're going to work out in terms of fairness, honesty, and truth. Then how we are approaching the whole idea of behavior modification. What are the abuse and misuse of behavior modification, and how we can use behavior modification within the context of positive Islamic cognitive behavior therapy. And we should be able to explain the concept of good and evil. What is good, what is evil? The concept of modeling in psychology. The effects of conditioning. The nature of force and aggression. This is also very important, especially for the ummah now, where the ummatic worldview now is shaped by the extremists, where they use force and aggression, which is un-Islamic, and we can explain this from the perspective of positive Islamic psychology and how we can change the mindset through positive Islamic cognitive behavior therapy. The nature of guilt, where Islam has a very good idea, where we are not born sinners. Opportunities and potential for success in life, to be achievers in life. The difference between inherent human potential, tendencies, and behavior. Collective human consciousness. Characteristic and factors of mental illness. And then the understanding of the self-fulfilling prophecy, the Pygmalion effect. Classification of mental illness, why treatment of mental illness fails now. So this again, we can have a better idea of therapeutic approach towards the whole range of psychological problems. Understanding phobias, cognitive dissonance, and how cognitive dissonance affects our thinking, behavior, and what are the remedies towards overcoming this whole idea of cognitive dissonance. And then we have this idea of how we're going to live the ummah through understanding of the spiritual and mystical knowledge, which will be the foundation, and then conclusion. So you can imagine, I'm just giving you just a heading only. There's 130 pages there. If you are interested in psychology, read this, and inshallah you will have a good idea that this fourth principle is very important. Holistic principles of human behavior and loss of learning, which then in chapter 5 will come with our PIE CBT model, how principle 1, 2, 3, 4 relate to this whole idea of our PIE CBT model, which we'll present inshallah.